So thank you so much for coming today. I don't know where you all are at, but I'm over here in Pismo Beach and it is a beautiful fall afternoon. My name is Mallory. I'm going to be the host today, and welcome to the Virtual Mind Walks program. The program is underwritten by the Thomas E. and Mary Kathryn Eltzroth Fund and supported by the Central Coast State Parks Association. Through today's presentation, feel free to use the Q&A and chat feature. And I might be able to answer some of those during the presentation, and we'll definitely tackle Q&A at the end today. But go ahead and pop your questions in at any time. So today's presentation we're very excited about. We have Jessica Griffiths here with us, and it's perfectly timed because we're kicking off the monarch migration season. And there's a great fundraising event coming up on October 23rd called the Butterfly Ball, and it's hosted by the Central Coast State Parks Association. It's an evening gala, and it's all in support of the education and conservation of the Western monarch butterfly. And Jessica Griffiths will be speaking at that event as well. So if you would love more information on that event, please visit centralcoastparks.org for tickets and info. And I'll put that into the chat box too, so that you can see it written. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jessica Griffiths. Jessica is a field biologist who has studied monarch butterflies on the Central Coast for over 20 years. She completed her master's at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo, where she conducted research on monarch butterfly behavior and ecology while working as coordinator of Cal Poly's Monarch Alert Research Program. She currently organizes the Xerces Society's Thanksgiving Count in San Luis Obispo County and conducts monarch monitoring and research in the area. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much, Valerie, for that introduction. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I am going to go ahead and share this. Okay. And hopefully you guys are seeing my full screen. And Mallory, you can tell me if anything gets messed up. But so the title of my talk today is Western Monarch Butterfly Conservation in a Changing World. And I'm going to talk to you all a little bit first about just the monarch butterfly life cycle and their biology, so you can learn a little bit about them. Then we're going to talk about some of the obstacles and problems facing monarch butterflies. And lastly, I'm going to cover what you and all of us can do to help monarch butterflies. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Oh, and there we go. Okay. So real briefly, I think probably everybody on this Zoom call is familiar with the basic monarch butterfly life cycle. The adults lay eggs, which hatch into larvae or caterpillars. These grow through 5 instars. They molt their skin every time until they get to the largest growth phase, and they form a pupa or chrysalis. They undergo complete metamorphosis, and an adult butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. The host plant of the butterfly is milkweed. This is the only plant that the caterpillars will eat. Now, they will eat all kinds of types of milkweed. There are many, many, many species found throughout North America. On the slide here, you will see 4 of the most common species of milkweed found in Central California. So what's really interesting is that milkweed contains toxins known as cardiac glycosides. And as you might guess from the name, they interfere with heart function if you take them in very large doses. Now, when they eat these toxins as caterpillars, the toxins go into the tissues of their body and remain within the caterpillar through metamorphosis into adults. And what it does is it gives the butterflies a very bad taste. So anything that might want to eat a butterfly will try eating it, and then it will spit it out right away because it tastes really gross. And you might wonder, well, how come the butterflies themselves aren't poisoned, well, they actually have a single mutation in their DNA that prevents those toxins from binding to the active site in the cell. So they are totally immune for it. Really cool. Adult monarchs, they drink nectar. That's all that they can eat. They will drink nectar, though, from just all kinds of flowers, really just about anything. And they drink nectar year round, especially, though, during the breeding season in the spring and the summer and migration. Now, monarch butterflies have a really interesting and unique sort of life cycle, especially for an insect. They actually have two types of generations and two types of butterflies, those that migrate long distances and those that are non-migratory. So in the summer, that's when we have adults that live just a few weeks. They're reproductively active, so they are looking for a mate. The females are laying eggs. They are non-migratory, so they're not traveling huge distances. And there are 3 or 4 generations of these sort of short-lived, reproductively active butterflies from spring all the way through summer into the late summer and early fall. Now, that last generation of butterflies that hatch out in August and September, they are the migratory and overwintering generation. These butterflies live 6 to 8 months. And these are the individuals that migrate to the overwintering sites in California or Mexico. They are not reproductively active at first until they spend the winter at the overwintering sites and then become reproductively active in the spring. And so when you really think about what this means, those winter generations, the butterflies going to the overwintering sites, they are separated from the previous overwintering butterflies by up to 4 summer generations. So they are the great-great-grandchildren of the ones that came before them. Okay, this map shows a little graphic representation of the fall migration. And what you might notice right away from looking at this map is that we've got 2 different populations of monarch butterflies. The eastern monarch butterflies live east of the Rocky Mountains. Those are the butterflies that go to Mexico. You can also see an arrow going to Florida. There are some that do end up in Florida, but most of them go to Mexico to spend the winter. Now, the western monarch butterflies live west of the Rocky Mountains, and the majority of those butterflies go to California. And that's the population. That's really what we're going to be talking about in the lecture today, is focusing on the issues faced by those butterflies. You will see that there are a couple of little arrows, though, going from the west down to Mexico. There are a small number of western butterflies that do in fact go to Mexico. And it's because the 2 populations mix that they are not actually 2 different species. There's enough genetic mixing that they're not genetically distinct. So after the butterflies spend the winters on their respective overwintering grounds, either in California or in Mexico, in the spring, those butterflies leave those overwintering grounds and they find milkweed to lay eggs on. They have done their mating frenzy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And they migrate back up. So you can see the eastern population goes up to the Gulf states. That's where they lay their first round of eggs, and then subsequent breeding summer generations sort of move farther and farther north. In the west, it's not quite so clear cut. You've got monarchs dispersing from the California coast, and usually it takes 2 or 3 generations to reach the very farthest northern or eastern areas of the Western Range, so up into Oregon, into Idaho, Montana. So it's really a lot of traveling that they're doing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the actual migration and how they do it. So monarch butterflies migrate during the day. They glide on high altitude winds, so they don't have to flap their wings the entire way. They actually start out flying near the ground in the morning when it's cooler, but then as the day warms and the air starts rising, they will fly higher and higher. And they mainly fly maybe a couple of 100 feet up in the air. However, occasionally they can get really high up because glider pilots have actually reported seeing migrating monarch butterflies at about 10,000 feet. That's unusual, though. Usually they're lower to the ground. The butterflies will stop flying. They come down in the evening and they stop every night. They will roost overnight in trees or shrubs, and then they refuel in the morning. They rapidly look for nectar. They look for blooming flowers, and they drink as much nectar as possible. And what they're doing is they're converting the sugar in the nectar into fat, and they're building up fat reserves because fat is the most efficient fuel. So that is what fuels their journey. Now, you might ask yourself, is there such a thing as a fat butterfly? The answer is actually yes. And here's the picture. So you guys see the butterfly on the left, the abdomen is much plumper than the one on the right. So the one on the left is migrating and it's ready to travel those really long distances. The one on the right still needs to drink more nectar. Okay. Some quick other fast facts about monarch migration. One of the best, biggest questions is, how do they actually do this? How do they find their way? Well, butterflies have a bunch of tools. They can actually use the sun to navigate. As the sun moves across the sky, they will actually change their heading according to the time of day. So they're always oriented the correct direction. Butterflies can also sense polarized light. So even if the sun is blocked by clouds, as long as they can see some blue sky, they can tell where the sun is. And last but not least, if it's completely cloudy, they can also sense the magnetic field of the Earth. So this is kind of a little funky diagram. If you can see my mouse here, what we're looking at is a stylized drawing. Imagine you're looking head on at a butterfly's face. So you've got the eye here, the gray thing on the left, and then the antenna sticking up. So this diagram shows where all their little tools are located. So their eyes detect the visible light and position of the sun. The dorsal rim area of their eye is what allows them to detect polarized light. They have a molecular clock in their antenna that tracks what time of day it is. And lastly, they have a molecular compass in their antenna, which detects the magnetic field of the Earth. So they're receiving all of this information, processing it in their little monarch brains, and then they're using that information to guide the direction of their flight. So it's pretty incredible when you think about all these navigational tools packed into such a tiny creature, but they really can do it. They have an amazing array of tools to navigate. Okay, so where are they going? They're going to these overwintering sites. Western monarch butterflies are primarily migrating to special overwintering sites along the coast of California. You can see these pictures here showing some of these groves of trees. And this map actually shows where all those overwintering sites are located. So each yellow dot is a site that has recorded clusters of monarch butterflies during the winter. And in this map, the map is actually slightly sort of tilted so we can see the whole coastline. This is about 600 miles of coastline. This is really different than the overwintering sites in Mexico, where the butterflies are all going to coniferous forests within a few square miles of each other. Here, the Western monarchs are really spread out all along the California coast and even down into Baja. You can see at the bottom there. There are hundreds of historic sites, but in a normal year, really maybe 100 or 150 of those actually have butterflies at them. And the arrow points out the location of Morro Bay because the lecture series is being presented by the Morro Bay Museum of Natural History. So for those of you that are in the San Luis Obispo County area, you know where that is. Okay, so what makes these overwintering sites special? Well, they're comprised of groves of trees, usually in an amphitheater or horseshoe formation. If you kind of think about trees in a U shape or a circle with an opening in the center. And these sites must have exactly the right microclimate. Now, microclimate just means the climate in a very small or localized spot, such as in a single grove of trees. And all these factors must be exactly right for the butterflies: temperature, humidity, sunlight, and wind speed. I mean, you really could say monarchs are a bit of a Goldilocks in that it really has to be exactly right for them. That's why you don't get butterflies just clustering in any old grove of trees. They really have very specific requirements. Also very important is an intact canopy. The canopy is really crucial for the microclimate because it acts like a blanket to stop heat from escaping, and it also acts as a shelter blocking high-speed winds or rain from storms. And so the monarchs form dense clusters in these trees at the overwintering sites, and they will cluster on lots of different species in California, including eucalyptus. So here are some really dense clusters of monarchs on eucalyptus trees. Monterey pine and Monterey cypress. These are native coniferous or conifer trees native to California. And coast redwood. Now this picture is kind of crazy. This is a giant cluster of several thousand butterflies on a redwood in Big Sur. So they can really pack in there. Let's talk quickly about what goes on with butterflies at those overwintering sites. So why the heck are they clustering in the first place? Well, it's actually helpful for them if they're clustering at cold temperatures. So the overwintering sites in California really don't get below freezing, but they can get pretty chilly. And it's actually been documented that it's a little bit warmer in the center of the cluster. So clustering together in those big numbers can help them regulate their temperature. And there's also safety in numbers. Now, we talked earlier about how monarchs, when they eat milkweed, they get a really bad, bitter taste from ingesting the chemicals in the milkweed. However, and there actually are quite a few different birds who can and will eat butterflies. And so by packing together in these dense clusters, that makes it a lot harder for a predator like a bird to pick out a single butterfly to eat. So that really does help them stay safe. During the winter, the butterflies are living off the fat stores. Remember that plump monarch that we saw earlier? So those fat stores need to last the butterflies through the winter, because historically, before European settlers came, there really weren't any winter blooming plants on the coast at those overwintering sites. The butterflies need those fat reserves to last the winter. And if the fat stores run out, then they have to leave the site and go search for nectar, which could be dangerous. It could, a predator could get them, or they could burn up their energy. So really, they're trying to live off the fat stores. And when they make it through the whole winter, then we have what we call the mating frenzy. So it's basically a butterfly orgy. And you get all the butterflies are all mating with each other in the spring. Traditionally, it's actually happened coincidentally right around Valentine's Day, which I think is kind of hilarious. So you get lots of butterflies. They're all mating. And then they disperse. They leave the overwintering sites. The females head out and they are searching for milkweed to lay their eggs on. Okay, so now we've talked sort of about the life cycle, what the butterflies need, the overwintering sites. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the challenges that are facing our Western monarch butterflies. So Western monarchs are in decline, and their population has actually been declining for quite a while, but only in the last few years has it really sharply crashed, basically. So I'm about to show you guys a population graph starting from 1997 going through 2019. Okay, now this data comes from the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, which is an annual census where hundreds of volunteers go out to all those overwintering sites. Remember all those yellow dots on the map? Volunteers go to all those sites and they count all the butterflies and they tally them up, and that is how we know the size of the Western population. So you can see in 1997, there were over 1 million butterflies, and prior to that, the population would really fluctuate. That's very typical of insect populations where you get these sort of boom and bust cycles, but it would usually be sort of up and down, around 1 million or so. Sometimes it would go down to 500,000, sometimes up harder, but kind of that. However, starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, the population dropped and it held steady for about 20 years at around 250 to 300,000 kind of average. You can see how it sort of hovered there. Well, then in 2018, there was a really big crash and the population went down to only 30,000 butterflies in all of the Western population, basically. And it stayed like that for 2019 as well. And then last year in 2020, there was an even further crash, which is this dot. It doesn't really even show up. There were about 2,000 butterflies that were counted at the overwintering count, which is really shocking. It's such a small number. So the big question, obviously, is what the heck happened? Why did we get these subsequent population crashes? What is going on? Why was there an initial decline? And it's taken us a really long time to figure out, but what we've got is there are several factors at play here. So let's talk about what's going on. Okay, why are they declining? And a biggie, I'm sure this is going to come as no surprise to anybody, is climate change. And we're going to go more in depth into that. Another big factor is land use changes. So loss of those overwintering sites on the coast of California, which are very important for their survival, as well as loss of breeding habitat, which is milkweed. And finally, sort of a ubiquitous threat to all insects is pesticides. So we're going to go through these one by one. Let's start with climate change. There is just a lot going on with climate change, and climate change is impacting the monarchs in a lot of different ways. And what we've come to realize over the last few years is that it seems that climate change is really having perhaps an even more severe effect on Western monarchs than it is Eastern monarchs. And if you think about it, Western North America has a very different climate than Eastern North America. It's much drier. It's already hotter. The cycle of water is very different. Usually in most Western states, it really doesn't, unless you're in the mountains, it doesn't really rain during the summer. And it only will rain during the winter. And you can go really months and months without having any moisture. So the smallest change in the moisture regime or in temperatures can have long-lasting effects. So what's going on with climate change at butterflies? Big one is the impacts that climate change are having on the overwintering sites. And we'll talk about that, but the sites are becoming degraded, mostly due to drought. It's also affecting the timing of when the butterflies leave the overwintering sites. We'll also talk more about that. It's impacting monarch metabolism. And so let's talk about the degradation of the overwintering sites. Okay, what we're really seeing here is impacts of drought in the Western states. I live in California, and those of you that live in California, I'm sure many of you on the Zoom call are from California, know that we've had some pretty severe droughts in the last few years. And what's happening is it's really affecting the overwintering sites that have eucalyptus trees. Now, eucalyptus are a non-native tree. They're native to Australia. They were brought to California in the 1800s, and they sort of were planted everywhere. And now monarch butterflies really like to use them. So lots of the overwintering sites where butterflies gather are groves of eucalyptus. Well, blue gum eucalyptus is not drought tolerant. And so we've seen just tons, thousands of eucalyptus trees killed by the drought. And that's what these pictures show, are dead trees. These are monarch butterfly sites where butterflies used to gather by the thousands, and now the trees are mostly or entirely dead. So it's really negatively affecting them. Loss of canopy happens when a tree gets drought stressed or when it dies. And remember that canopy is so important to regulating the microclimate. So if you don't have a sufficient canopy or any canopy at a site, it's not going to be suitable for the butterflies. And actually, I found these Google image aerial photos to really show you guys what it looks like sort of from a bird's eye or monarch's eye perspective. So this is a site called Halcyon Hill. This is in southern San Luis Obispo County. And this photo is from 2007, which is pre our sort of severe drought that started in like 2012, 2013, 2014. You can see the canopy is pretty intact. Well, here's a picture from 2018, okay? This really shows you the effects of the drought, and you can see the loss of canopy. You can see how every single eucalyptus tree has lost canopy, and you can see the ground in between all the trees. So this is what we're looking at a lot of sites, particularly in central and southern California. Northern California, not so much. The drought wasn't as severe there, but in a lot of places, this is what we're looking at. So, and when eucalyptus trees start dying, a lot of times they will get cut down because now they're a hazard to people or to structures. They're also a fire hazard. So once the tree gets sick, stressed, or dying, it's now at risk of just being straight up chopped down. So we're also seeing a lot of sites being lost that way. Okay, what's going on with the site departure? So monarch butterflies typically leave the overwintering sites around late February, early March. Historically speaking, say 10 years ago or more, that's what we would see. We would see clusters of butterflies all the way through into March. And their departure is timed to coincide with the growth of milkweed. So the females will leave the site. This is a really cool picture of a monarch butterfly laying an egg on some sprouting milkweed. and the females will get out to the areas where the milkweed is growing as the milkweed starts coming up. So the cycle of the butterflies and the milkweed is in sync. Well, now what we're seeing is due to the warming and just the overall decrease in the monarch population, the butterflies are leaving the sites earlier and earlier and earlier. And now, in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, we're seeing the butterflies are gone from the sites by February. They're leaving as soon as January sometimes. And what this is resulting in is something that we call a phenological mismatch. And phenology is the study of the timing of natural cyclical events. So things like migration or the life cycle of an animal. And a phenological mismatch happens when the life cycles of two organisms are not in sync. So what we're seeing now is that monarchs are leaving the overwintering site before the milkweed has sprouted. So they kind of get out to these areas and there's no milkweed yet. And they have to basically wait around for it to grow. And they're doing that waiting away from the safety of the overwintering sites. And they're now vulnerable to cold weather, to storms, to rain, to early freezes, to predators. At least one study has suggested that this early spring mortality could be really high. So we still don't know the full effects of what could be happening here, but it's certainly a negative thing that is happening to them. Okay. Climate change effects on monarch metabolism. Let's talk about the larva. So monarch caterpillar growth is temperature dependent. And what that means is the hotter it is, the faster the caterpillars will actually grow. Now, that can actually be beneficial up to a certain point. So when you're getting up into the 70s and 80s, boy, the caterpillars love that and they will get bigger, they'll grow faster. However, you cross a certain threshold where now it's actually too hot and the caterpillars are getting heat stressed. And so what that means is eventually the temperatures will get so high that they'll stop eating and they'll even start dying. And experiments have shown that short exposure to high temperatures doesn't really hurt them, but prolonged exposure to high temperatures, especially in the mid to high 90s, that increases the chance of mortality. It increases the chance of the caterpillars dying really significantly. And when, I've lived in California for 20 years and it's really only been getting hotter and hotter. When we have these heat waves where you're getting triple digits for like a week, that could really be doing severe damage to these poor caterpillars. So it could be really harmful. The overwintering adults are also being impacted by higher temperatures. Remember the fat source that we talked about. So those butterflies arrive at the overwintering sites with fat stored in their abdomen. Now, high temperatures lead to higher metabolism. So if it's the warmer it is, the faster the adult butterflies will burn through their fat reserves. And if they use up their fat, they have to search for nectar. We talked about that earlier too. And that search for nectar could leave them vulnerable. So potentially that could be causing stress to those butterflies. It could mean that the overwintering adults don't have the energy reserves to survive through the winter. We just don't know. Okay, so stepping away from that was kind of all the stuff that climate change does. Now let's go back to some non-climate change problems, and that's loss of overwintering habitat. And for the majority of the time, that is really human caused. What we're seeing now is utility companies are doing a lot of tree trimming around power lines, and that is to reduce fire risk. Technically, that actually is climate related because as the climate changes, the risk of fires out west gets higher and higher. So we're seeing a lot of power line trimming, and the utility companies don't have to have permits or any permission at all. They can just go in and cut trees around the power lines, which nobody's saying that they shouldn't be able to do that. However, a lot of times they're cutting down monarch trees. We've also got trimming and removal of just hazard trees in general. For instance, if the tree is stressed or dying, or people perceive it as a nuisance, it will get cut down. This particularly happens eucalyptus. This picture on the right part of the screen is not a very good picture, but this showed what happened when state parks cut down eucalyptus trees. They determined that the roots of the eucalyptus trees were getting too close to some water pipelines at a campground, so they cut the trees down. And this was a monarch butterfly overwintering site. So, it can really happen anywhere. And of course, development. This has been a perpetual problem because eucalyptus trees are not native. You don't need a permit to cut them down generally, or you haven't in the past. And so if people want to build houses, housing developments, or whatever, eucalyptus trees can just get cut down. So, every year we're losing sites to development. So there's just a lot of pressure on these overwintering sites. And last but not least, we have pesticides. Particular neonicotinoid pesticides, also known as neonics. This is the group of, some of you may have heard of these pesticides because they've been really strongly implicated in honeybee declines. And there's a whole family of them. They're really effective insecticides. And so the agricultural industry has really embraced them. And there's been a ton of papers. This is just one showing that the increase in neonic use is corresponding with the decline of butterfly fauna. So what we're seeing is as more and more pesticides are being applied, you can see the graph on the left there is the amount of pesticides being applied in each county. And the graph on the right is the decline in butterfly species diversity. So how many different kinds of butterflies were found at these sites. So you've got increase in pesticides, decrease in butterflies. And unfortunately, the amount of neonics being applied is just increasing. Now, this graph only goes to 2012, and I couldn't find anything more recent, but it's been a very dramatic increase. So, and they're still very popular, and not just neonics affect monarchs, all pesticides do. The biggest way that it affects monarch butterflies is not what we call necessarily direct mortality, which is that the pesticide gets on the caterpillar or the butterfly and just kills it. But what we're seeing are what we call sublethal effects. That means that if the caterpillar or adult ingests or somehow comes into contact with a small amount of the pesticide, it doesn't necessarily outright kill it. However, it makes it weaker, less able to forage, less able to fly as far. Maybe the caterpillar will go into chrysalis sooner and come out smaller. Like, you're just seeing all these sort of knock-on effects that could be affecting the ability of them to survive. So it's not a great scene. Now, I've just told you about all this crazy stuff that's happening. The Western monarch population has crashed. There's no denying that. However, something really interesting is happening. And something that we're seeing is a sort of possible state change in monarch butterflies. And so at the same time that the migratory population has collapsed, basically, we're seeing an increase in the number of year-round resident or non-migratory butterflies in coastal areas, particularly urban areas where there are lots and lots of gardens. And what we might be seeing is monarch butterflies basically shifting, Western monarch butterflies specifically shifting from a sort of migration strategy to a non-migratory strategy. We might be losing the migration, instead gaining butterflies that just are staying in one spot all year round. This paper, I snipped the the title of the paper, Resilience or Catastrophe, Possible State Change for Monarch Butterflies in the West. And so this paper examines the possibility that we may be seeing an increase in the number of sedentary or non-migratory butterflies. Now, what does that actually mean? This current sort of urban residential population is still orders of magnitude smaller, much, much smaller than what the migratory population was from even a few years ago. So it's not really necessarily sufficient to make up for the loss of those migratory butterflies. However, this growing resident population may have the capacity to persist in the sense that, the Western population won't go extinct. There will still be butterflies kind of hanging out in these areas. So that remains to be seen. We'll kind of see what what happens with that. We're sort of in unknown territory right now, and all the monarch butterfly counters and volunteers and researchers and biologists, we're just all waiting to see what happens next. And this is from that paper. You can kind of see the orange areas are areas where we're seeing this big increase in resident monarch butterflies, and the little green dots are all the overwintering sites. Okay, that was like 15 minutes of doom and gloom for you guys, and I'm definitely not going to end it there. Okay, what the heck can we do? Can we make a difference? Yes, we can, absolutely. I want to tell you that there are lots of things we can do to help monarch butterflies. Okay, don't give up. Monarch butterflies are really tough like Mr. T. They can survive. We just have to help them. Okay, they're like most insects. Monarch butterflies lay lots of eggs. A single female can lay over 400 eggs. So they have the capacity to rebound. They really just need suitable habitat. They need milkweed. They need overwintering sites with the right climate and the right microclimate. And so we can help them. All right, what the heck can we do? All right, this is kind of the part of the presentation where if you haven't been taking notes, you might want to, because I'm going to give you lots of stuff that you can do. Okay, you can support, if you live in California, or even if you don't, no matter where you live, you can support organizations that protect and manage overwintering sites. So if you're in the West, that would be organizations that protect overwintering sites. State parks, California State Parks is a great example. They manage a lot of different overwintering sites. U.S. Forest Service, there's also cities that have preserves. So if you live on the coast, find out where the nearest overwintering site is to you and find out who's protecting it. If you live in the eastern U.S., you're looking for organizations that protect those Mexican overwintering grounds, of which there's quite a few. So see what you can do. Contact your local politician, your local council member, state rep, senator, ask for better protections of monarch habitat. There's actually 2 bills working their way through the Senate right now, providing funding for monarch butterfly habitat restoration, conservation, research, etc. So ask your local politicians to support that kind of legislature. In order to battle the rising tide of pesticides, as often as you can, buy organic. You know, you're basically saying with your dollars, I don't support pesticides. So it is more expensive, but as much as you can, buy organic, and also go organic in your own garden. If you have a garden, don't use pesticides or chemicals in your garden. Look for natural alternatives to pest control. As we said, and encourage friends and neighbors to do the same. This is really huge, and you can really make a difference in your own backyard. Okay, you can also become a scientist and study and help other scientists learn more about monarchs. If you become a citizen or community scientist, there's all kinds of ways you can collect data about butterflies that can help us learn more. If you live in California, you could volunteer to count monarchs. You can go to this website, westernmonarchcount.org. There's actually the 2021 Thanksgiving count is coming up. If you live on the coast of California, there may be a site near you. Go to the website. There's a map. You can look up what the nearest site is, and you can volunteer to be a counter. There will be trainings, virtual or in-person trainings in the fall, depending on where the site is. There's a count in November, and there's another one in early January. You can monitor monarchs in your own backyard. If you've got butterflies, you can collect data on them. You can download the iNaturalist app on your smartphone, and anytime you see not just a monarch butterfly, but any butterfly, you can log it in. That data gets used by scientists. You can also contribute to all these different projects. So Journey North is a project that tracks monarch migration, as well as looking at monarch caterpillars, eggs, and chrysalises. So they are the ones tracking the monarch migration, really. So if you see monarch butterflies in the spring, or you see them in the fall, you can go onto the Journey North website and you can log in your sighting, and they make this really cool map every year kind of showing how the monarchs are migrating. You can tell us where milkweed is by, especially if you live in the Western US, by going online to the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper and marking the location. If you are driving down the road, you see milkweed, you can map it. Hey, there's milkweed here. If you've got it in your own property, you can map it. And last but not least, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project is a nationwide project where you can actually go out and look at milkweed and write down if you see any eggs, caterpillars, or adult monarchs. That all gets submitted to a giant database. All of this data is going to researchers to help us understand what's happening with butterflies. So you can, all of these are really great with kids too, or grandkids. Okay, what can you do in your backyard? Well, you can plant a nectar garden and you can feed hungry monarch butterflies, because almost anywhere in the US, adult butterflies are going to be migrating through right about now. In fact, planting flowers that bloom in the fall as the butterflies are coming through in the fall, and in early spring as they're coming back, are really helpful. I picked some flowers. You know, I live in Central California. These are some native California plants, things like yarrow, sunflower, penstemon, goldenrod, hummingbird sage, thistle. But honestly, if you just go online and you type in, you know, where you live and like butterfly garden or nectar plants, you're going to get, you can even go to your local garden center and find out what would be good, because a lot of garden centers have that information now. But the internet is a treasure trove. There's so many resources online to help you plan a nectar garden. And you won't just be helping monarchs, you'll also be helping all kinds of other pollinators too. You can also plant milkweed. If you are in basically anywhere in Eastern North America, plant milkweed, go crazy. If you live in the West, again, plant your native species. If you live in coastal California, you want to plant milkweed away from the coast. If you live north of Santa Barbara, that's because milkweed doesn't historically grow right on the coast north of Santa Barbara. But if you live almost anywhere else, you can plant it. And monarch butterflies, you don't want to plant the milkweed real close to the overwintering sites, because when you get so many monarch butterflies, they'll actually all lay their eggs on that milkweed right near the overwintering site, and then there's too many caterpillars on each milkweed plant, and it becomes a situation. So plant them away from the overwintering sites. And this is just a list of 4 common coastal California species, but again, you can go on the internet and you can find out what milkweed species are native to where you live. These are some pictures. Milkweeds, native milkweeds are beautiful, and they're a wonderful addition to any garden. Okay, so I'm wrapping up. In summary, plant nectar plants for those adult butterflies. Plant native milkweed away from the coast if you live north of Santa Barbara, California. Go organic as much as you can. Become a monarch advocate and collect that data. Become a community scientist. So lots to be done. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap up and pause in my talking and see if there's any questions. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Let's see, there we go. Okay. We'll let Mallory come back and see if there's any questions for me.
I'm back.
There she is.
So we went through the questions in the Q&A. We had a lot of good questions pop up. And the one that I answered that I just wanted to double check with you on. So we had an inquiry about the overwintering site in Morro Bay, or near the golf course area.
Yes.
And so I just logged on and looked at the stats. And unfortunately, the spreadsheet I had didn't list 2020, but in 2019, I saw that there were, it looked like there was a count of 0. And then before that, it was very low at around 50. And like my knowledge, I kind of remember that I think the count in 2020 there was 0 as well.
Yeah, so there's a few different sites, all kind of around Morro Bay. There's one that's actually in the golf course, like on the actual golf course itself. And then there's a bunch that are in the state park, like around there. And yeah, unfortunately in 2020, you guys saw that really big drop. I mean, there were only 2,000 butterflies in the entire state. So most of the sites didn't have any. The Morro Bay golf course itself is still really important, and the sites around there, around in Morro Bay State Park, are also really important. 2 or 3 years ago, they still did have butterflies, and there were some monarchs seen in there were actually monarchs in several Morro Bay sites. So this year, we really don't know. Some people think that there might be more butterflies this year. Some people think there might be the same. We really don't know. So I unfortunately can't speak to it. Last year was, I will say, was pretty grim. Most sites didn't have any, but that's not to say that those sites aren't still important for the monarchs, because they definitely are. You know, the sites are still intact. It's just that, you know, we had this giant population crash. So we want to continue to protect and maintain those sites. And who knows? I mean, there might be more back this year. But yeah, Morro Bay is a really important place for the butterflies. And there's a lot of important sites there still.
Okay, great. And then let's see, let's answer this one live.
Okay.
What are the odds that butterflies are going somewhere else? And how can we find them if they are in new places that had not been historically?
That is a absolutely fantastic question. And it's actually a really important one, because first of all, I want to say you're right. That was actually one of the big questions, particularly after we had sort of this weird plateau that the butterflies reached in the mid 2000s. We're like, okay, we're kind of surveying the same sites over and over. Are we getting them all? Are we visiting? You know, how do we find new sites? So actually in 15, 16, we started really expanding our volunteer efforts and basically putting the call out to anybody, like, if you know anybody who's seen butterflies like anywhere, that we haven't found too many, although every year we actually do get probably one to three new overwintering sites, places where butterflies really hadn't been observed before, or they've been observed there like 20 years ago, hadn't been seen there for like 20 years, and then suddenly there's like 500 of them that show up. So what we need is, like, honestly, even more boots on the ground, you know, eyes out there looking for these sites. So as climate change causes warming, what we're seeing is the butterflies, those Southern California sites, are really becoming essentially inactive. There's just not that many butterflies clustering in Southern California. And the big question is, well, are they moving north? And that seems to be where we may be seeing more butterflies in the coming years, is just sort of moving up the coast. The other potential is that we may see butterflies moving up in elevation. So particularly on in Big Sur and in areas like Santa Barbara, where you've got mountains that are kind of like really close to the coast. If there are potentially suitable groves of trees, you could get monarchs actually moving up in elevation where it's cooler. We don't have, right now, there's no really good sort of statewide or, you know, systematic way that we're searching for new sites. But I will say that a lot of the folks who are in charge of that kind of thing are very aware that we really need to be thinking about how to look for those new sites. So it's definitely on our minds, for sure. Did I answer both of that, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
And let's see. Peggy Burhan asked that question. Peggy, let us know if you need
Oh, I know Peggy.
to expand. Yeah.
we could talk about
Yeah.
getting like some monarch patrols or something, you know, out there. It's honestly needed, because with the size of the crash that we saw, we really don't think, you know, to go from, you know, 250,000 butterflies to 2,000 butterflies in 3 years, there's no way that all of them went somewhere else. But they could be in other places that we just don't know about. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. And it's something we all need to be thinking about, for sure.
Okay, let's see what we have here. Let's answer this one live, because this is a great question. If any of you listening are educators, or if you have family members that are teachers, this is a good one. So so many classrooms have milkweed and caterpillars this time of year. And also a lot of local nurseries sell milkweed this time of year. And so they're saying, is that not a good idea?
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, so the whole like coastal milkweed thing, it's definitely a complicated issue. The only thing we can really agree on is to not plant the milkweed right, like the Xerces recommendation, I believe, was 5 miles from the coast. The overwintering sites, almost all the overwintering sites in California are within 1 mile of the coast. So if you live north of Santa Barbara, you really don't want to plant milkweed within 1 mile of the coast. So a little more inland. I think actually it's fantastic. Now, if the school is like right next, like within a mile of an overwintering site, that's a little more challenging because I'm obviously very hugely in favor of teaching kids about monarchs and getting kids excited just about nature in general. And monarchs are a fantastic way to do that because they're colorful, they're easy to see, it's a really cool life cycle. I think with your milkweed too, you want to also really pay attention to the kind of milkweed that you're growing and make sure that you've got either native milkweed, or if you don't have native milkweed, a lot of gardens use what's called tropical milkweed. That's actually what's sold at a lot of nurseries. It's also labeled as like butterfly weed. I've seen it called like butterfly weed. It's got like bright, like orange, red, and yellow flowers. It grows really fast, really easy to cultivate, and butterflies do eat it. And so it's very popular. However, you want to really be careful if you're planting tropical milkweed because tropical milkweed doesn't die back in the winter like all of our native milkweeds do. And it can actually lead to the monarchs spreading diseases to each other. So if you've got milkweed in a garden on the coast, yeah, there's not an easy answer for it. The recommendation is to do your best to not, but if you've got a school, what I would probably do is sort of wait till the caterpillars are kind of done and cut back the tropical milkweed to the ground, and it will grow back, and then it won't have the this particular parasite on it that tends to impact monarchs. That's kind of a whole other thing. I realize I'm getting a little bit of a wishy-washy answer because there's unfortunately not a really solid answer either way. And sometimes there's conflicting advice, but I really am pretty much always in favor of like kids getting to see it. But if there's any way to maybe switch your school milkweed to native milkweed, that would be really huge. Or even to just, what you can do actually is you can get monarch parasite testing kits. And it's actually really easy. Like you can do it. And if you've got older kids, like I think even kids who are like 8, 9 years old can do it. And you can go to, I think the website is Monarch Health. And you can order monarch like testing kits. So if you've got caterpillars, chrysalises, especially adult butterflies that come out, you can catch them in a net and you can do a quick little test. It doesn't hurt the butterfly, and you can find out if your monarchs have this parasite. And if they do, then you may need to make some changes to how your garden is being, sort of run at the school. But I would recommend that if you've got a school garden, you participate in that Monarch Health initiative. I just saw somebody posted a link in the chat. So yeah, you can Google that and you can get a free kit, and it's pretty easy.
Okay, good. Let's see. We'll do one more question. This is kind of a big one, Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
What caused the huge decline between 2008 and 2009? All the reasons given for the decline over time wouldn't have happened within a 1-year time period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A great question. And what caused the huge decline between 2008 and 2009. Hang on a second. Is that, do you mean the big crash that happened in 2018? Hang on a second. I'm looking back at my little population map. Yeah, actually, can the person who typed that
Elaine?
maybe clarify? Yeah, Elaine, can you clarify? Because there wasn't a big decline between 2008 and 2009. But I can answer, I can talk about the crash that happened in 2018, that dropped from like 250,000 butterflies down to 30,000. That was the first big one. And honestly, I know it's not going to be a really satisfying answer, but it was kind of a perfect storm type thing. So the population was already at sort of a low level. So 250,000 monarchs is really not where the population should have been. It's just been sort of holding steady there. And in 2016 and 17, it actually gone a little bit down. And the reigning theory right now is in the spring of 2018, the monarch butterflies left the overwintering sites early, maybe too early. This has been happening, that had been happening now for a few years, where they've been leaving the sites in like really February. They hadn't been hanging out into March. And so spring of 2018, pretty much all the monarch overwintering sites were basically empty by March. That March was what we call in California a quote miracle March, which means it had been a pretty mild and dry winter. And then all of a sudden in March, we got a ton of rain. We got storms. We got in the Central Valley and in the mountains, we got freezes. Like it got very cold. It was rainy and stormy. And what we think might have happened is all those butterflies that were out, on the landscape, kind of looking for milkweed that hadn't grown yet, got basically killed by the weather, or were somehow not able, that generation that left the overwintering sites was not able to lay their eggs. And what we saw in the summer of 2018, there'd been monitoring at different milkweed patches all over the Western US, or we're talking Oregon, Washington, California. That year, there were almost no eggs and caterpillars. So we had, a kind of a quote normal Thanksgiving count that fall. And all of a sudden now that spring, there's like basically no reproduction. And the prevailing theory was that it was this, kind of literal perfect storm, and that there was this just really bad weather and it prevented those monarchs from laying the eggs. And so then it almost broke the cycle where now you didn't have enough butterflies, that shorter, those summer, reproductive generations, there weren't enough. And the butterflies barely made it there were almost no butterflies in Oregon and Washington that year. Very, very, very low reproduction. And then in the fall, there were only 30,000 butterflies counted at all of the overwintering sites. 2019, it was the same. We had, again, about 30,000 butterflies. And then in 2020, the spring of 2020, the same kind of weather happened. We had, again, a pretty mild winter. The butterflies left the overwintering sites. They were all gone by February. And then in March, we had a ton of storms. It was very cold. Same thing, basically almost no reproduction at any of those milkweed, the normal breeding sites around California and around the West. And then come fall of 2020, there's just basically no butterflies, 2000. So what we're getting are these events that are knocking back the population. Now, if the population was at the level that it, quote, should be historically, if there were 1 million butterflies, this type of, kind of weather disasters would cause mortality, but it wouldn't cause such a huge decline because you would have lots of butterflies. And these not to get too in the weeds here, but this kind of sort of random weather event that has a large impact on a population, these are called stochastic events. They're basically random events that they can't really be predicted, and they have a negative, or large impact on a population. When your population is already very small, these stochastic events have a disproportionate or outsized effect. So if the population was large and healthy, you probably wouldn't see such a drastic decline due to these storms. Right. Oh, Elaine clarified. Okay. I just gave a big long talk, but she clarified when the population went from like 1 million butterflies suddenly down to, like 250,000. Okay. That's a great question. And unfortunately, I believe that was actually just an artifact of when the Thanksgiving count started. And I should have, I need to get the kind of graph that shows prior to 1997, where you had these like really huge, like up and down fluctuations. And so you had a big drop, but then the key was they never went back up. And that we're not 100% sure why. What happened? Why were they not getting back up again? And there's a couple of different possible explanations for that. One is that the count became totally standardized, and everybody was using the same count methods. Now, that's not to say that the data before that was totally worthless, but also that is when we started getting more severe droughts. Also at that time, not to really overcomplicate the issue, but the eastern population is also declining. And the two populations are linked, although not totally. Both eastern and western populations are declining. And so there's some similar factors happening there. But I will say this, I don't think it was like, I think there was a little bit of wiggle room in those early numbers. So I know that's not a super satisfying answer, but I think climate change was already happening. Loss of overwintering sites was already happening. Loss of milkweed was already happening. And, you just get something that can kind of knock them back, and they just never were really recovering. So that's our best guess as to sort of what was going on there.
I was trying to find that chart too. I was like going through my
Yeah.
I think I found one chart, but I'm not sure it's the right one. Anyways. Okay, well, we answered most of the questions. I apologize to those of you who submitted questions and we didn't quite get to them. We're a little past 2, so I am going to be respectful of everyone's time, and we'll kind of close out the presentation now. But thank you so much, Jessica, for taking the time to be here with us today and talk about this with us, because it's so important, and a lot of people are so passionate about the monarchs, and so we really appreciate you and everything you're doing.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's question. I'm happy to reply to stuff over email or what have you, but also some of the stuff might be out there on Google too.
Yeah.
Not to pawn you off on Google, but thank you so much for having me. I had a great time, and I hope that everybody learned something and came away that yes, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The situation is very dire for Western monarchs, but I think that there is still hope. So I think we can figure out a way through and hopefully help the monarchs bounce back on the other side.
Yeah. And we would really appreciate it too. Those of you who are attending, as you close out, there'll be a little survey that pops up. If you have already filled out the survey for us in the past, you can just go ahead and skip that. But we would love and appreciate your feedback. It helps us make the program better each time. So thank you so much. And we hope everyone has a really nice weekend. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.